Essence of systems methodology. One of the most important methodologies in system thinking is using multiple perspectives. If I analyze a system, or if I design a new system, or if one intervenes in a system, one needs to employ multiple perspectives. To give an example, most of us had the experience that we have a dinner table discussion and somebody makes a statement like, the population explosion is responsible for poverty, and somebody immediately jumps in and says, well, no, I think it's the climate change, or it's the finance crisis, or it's the crime, or it's the lack of schooling, and suddenly there's a fight where different parties defend their position. As a system thinker, we would act completely different. We would merely employ the question, what else? So if somebody makes a statement, the population explosion causes poverty, we would say, right, what else? And somebody else says, the finance crisis, right, what else? Climate change, unemployment, what else? Education, and so on. The simple question, what else, immediately elicits different perspective of a situation. Later on, we will get some more qualifications about these perspectives. We could look for economic perspectives, political perspectives, cultural perspectives, technological, and so on. So there are checklists that we could employ to get different perspectives from a situation. So a system viewed from different perspectives gets much richer, and we get closer to the reality of what the system is about. Another important methodological contribution of system thinking is that of iteration. Iteration means again and again. So we are going in circles around a specific issue. Now, going in circles doesn't mean that we are going over and over the same thing as before. As it is illustrated on the figure here, the circles tend to get narrower over time, and the discussions or the iteration occurs on a different logical plane. So once we have agreement on one level, we can go on to another level and review it and get maybe more agreement. Ultimately, we want synergy from iteration. We want the diverse, seemingly conflicting parties that have different parts of different perspectives of a situation. We want them aligned around issues that contain the perspectives of the others, and that is what we mean by synergy. Sometimes we have to iterate between the part and the whole. If we're looking at a house that we design, we have an overall design of the house, and when we start looking in more detail into the individual rooms and how we divide up the house, it may well be necessary that we say we better make that wall 2 meters further away to accommodate the room in a better way. So there will be an iteration between the parts and the whole. In an organizational context, we can also look at the different parts of an organization. So the example we had earlier with business development and how we need to change the IT system and skills development in order to accommodate new business development. There will be an iteration between those different parts of the organization and, of course, many other functional parts until we come to a clear strategy. There can also be an iteration between a system and its environment, stakeholders or other systems in the environment. If we want to change something about the education system, we will have to iterate through the different variables and align those perspectives within a design that makes sense in terms of all the different variables. Sometimes one has to iterate between the long term and the short term, that a short term change now has an impact on longer term developments, or I'm changing a longer term perspective and I have to iterate back that I need to do something different from now on in the short term. And there can also be an iteration between undesirable and desirable elements, between problems and solutions, so to speak. Sometimes when we work on a solution, another problem crops up, so we iterate back to the problem, iterate back to the solution, until we have an all-inclusive design. The more difficult task is, the more diverse the perspectives are, the more stakeholders there are involved, the larger the system is, the more iterations will be required. So a change manager who goes through iterations is not ineffective. This is the nature of systems thinking, that we have to iterate. Self-referral is another important methodology, systemic methodology. It implies that the self reflects any new information or any new impact that comes to it against its own ethos. So, for example, if I'm teaching system thinking, you as the learner will have to reflect what I teach against your own values, against your own worldview, beliefs, and then make a decision if what I'm saying makes sense for you or not. So self-referral closes loops from connectivity, so it closes the loop between you and me. I impact on you through my teaching, you close the loop in self-reflection. The same would occur mutually if we were to engage in a direct interaction. And it also would occur in situations of iteration where we are each time closing the loop and saying, does that new position that's on the table make sense for me or not? Self-referral creates meaning because once we have self-reflected, we know if there's meaning or not attached to the impact. It is very important in development and learning. In fact, without self-referral, there is no development and learning. If there's no self-reflection on your part, what I'm talking, then there's rote learning or no learning. And reflection leads to self-awareness. By being stimulated with a new thought, you are actually becoming aware what you have been thinking before that prompter came. Another systemic method is associated with paradox. If we have many diverse views within the system, some of those views will be paradoxical in the sense that they can't be resolved. And it would involve transforming either or position into as well as positions. Now, if you're looking at an either or position, some can be resolved within the spectrum of the either or. If we have wage negotiations and the one side wants 10% increase and the other side wants to only give 5% increase, we can negotiate somewhere between the 5 and 10%. However, if we have either ors that are mutually exclusive, that are qualitatively different items, like for example the marketing sales position versus the production position, we cannot find compromise between the two because it's qualitatively different, and we would have to resolve it in such a way that we are looking at differentiation, that would be customization on the one side and integration or standardization on the other side. And between the two, we would have to find the optimal path of development at any particular time. If we have little customization, then we need little standardization. If we have more customization or differentiation, we need more integration. Another important consideration in a systems methodology is limits. Typically, as systems grow and develop, they hit limits in their environment. These limits are referred to as carrying capacity. If the system exceeds carrying capacity, it can collapse the system and its environment. A typical example of that situation is in agriculture, the carrying capacity associated with a piece of land. For example, many third world countries still have tribal-based subsistence agriculture, tribal lands, where every family of the community can put their animals for grazing. So if, for argument's sake, the carrying capacity of a specific piece of land is 60, and there are 20 families, and each family gives one cow out for grazing, this is well within carrying capacity, and the cows will be very healthy. Likewise with 40, as the carrying capacity of 60 cows is being reached, there may be problems starting. That if it was a particularly dry season, 60 may just be a little too much, or if it was a wet season, then maybe 62 cows would be fine. But if that carrying capacity is exceeded, we are overshooting it, then there will be systems collapse. The commons get overgrazed, all blades of grass are being eaten up, and the whole commons is unable to support even a single cow. The system has collapsed. So as systems grow over time, they need to stay within the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity can be in the outer environment, like the example of the cow. A typical example that we experience now is that of climate change. We are seemingly exceeding the absorbing capacity, which is a form of carrying capacity of the atmosphere, of absorbing greenhouse gases without negative effect on other systems. We don't know yet if the tipping point is reached, but typically after a tipping point is reached, systems collapse ensues. We can also reach limits in the inner environment. For example, our physiological functioning is supporting particular behavior, but not beyond. So if we are overworking, we are not sleeping and resting enough, sooner or later a tipping point will be reached, or an overshoot situation can occur, and our health will be damaged. We have overshot the limits of carrying capacity of our physiology. If a system wants to carry on or needs to carry on growing beyond carrying capacity, for example, the communities grew from 60 families to 100 families, but the land stays the same, there needs to be a different interaction between the community and the land. The system of agriculture needs to be transformed. Transformation is another important methodological concept. Exceeding limits like carrying capacity requires transformation of the system. So if we have a specific system with a specific limit or carrying capacity, the system developing over time needs to stay below the limit to avoid damage to the environment and itself. Typically, as limits are being reached, there is a crisis situation starting. Things get a bit difficult, and there are signposts that we need to change and transform the system to allow the system to carry on growing in time. That new behavior will reach new limits in time, with a crisis necessitating a transformation, and so on. So if we look at our subsistence agriculture model of the cows grazing, as populations increase, we need to embrace industrial agriculture. Some years ago, there was a study done by the World Bank which showed that subsistence agriculture could only support a fraction of the 42 sub-Saharan African countries, and that most of them required intermediate or industrial agriculture. As soon as industrial agriculture is reached, we need another transformation into information agriculture, for example, computer-controlled irrigation, temperature control, etc. And when that reaches its limit, there will have to be some other form of agriculture. We will later on see the same picture again occurring in organizations. As organizations grow, they hit limits and they need to transform and carry on growing into a new mode of functioning. So the limits and transformation is true for all systems if they need to exceed limits. Let us summarize what is the essence of systems methodology. We said multiple perspectives are the basis for every methodology. Different stakeholders see the system differently and act differently vis-à-vis the system. And the whole system is more than the sum of the different multiple perspectives. So the more perspectives we can bring to the table, the closer we approximate an understanding of the system. Iteration is another important systems principle, and what it implies is that we need to, when we do changes, iterate back to review the changes and maybe make amendments, because as change is starting in one point, it ripples through the system and its connecting systems, and change may ripple back and it may be different than expected and amendments may have to be made. So iterating is typical for systems methodologies. Self-referral is another important principle. It is the basis of decision making, the basis of learning, development, sense making, and also the basis of awareness. Paradox typically occurs when different stakeholders have different interests, different demands, different perspectives of a situation, and often these perspectives or demands are paradoxical. In other words, they're mutually exclusive, and we need to learn to integrate them within a larger whole. So diverse perspectives need to be transcended by a context or a larger whole within which both can be accommodated. So either or has to become win-win. And typically this is done that we are looking at when, in which context is the one part of the paradox relevant and how can we build that into our system, and in which situations is the other paradoxical side relevant and what needs to be done and how can we build that into the system, so that we are making the system relevant for both parts of the paradox. As systems grow and develop, they hit limits, and these limits typically in the outer and inner environment or sometimes in the system itself. And if the system wants to carry on and growing beyond those limits, it needs to transform itself. If it does not, it can cause systems collapse. So systems transformation is essential if systems want to grow beyond existing limits.